much, and good morning, afternoon and evening to everyone tuning in. Thank you all for registering. I look forward to spending the next hour and a bit with you guys. So I'll jump straight into what we're going to get into today. First of all, I'm going to start with a bit of background on who I am, how I got to this point, my background in anaerobic speed reserve and power reserve, and what that might mean for triathlon. This really is going to be a bit of an ideas meeting. So I'm going to ask you to imagine as we go through this. I'm going to really share with you how this concept of anaerobic speed reserve, anaerobic power reserve has really transformed my thinking and how I look at high performance demands of events and training of athletes. And throughout, it's going to be littered with practical applications for coaches, practitioners in triathlon. So a bit of background on myself. So I'm actually from the UK over here, and there I studied at Loughborough University. And then in 2015, I moved to New Zealand to do a PhD on the anaerobic speed reserve with the Athletics Federation there, the Institute of Science and Medicine, and AUT University in Auckland. And then I'm currently located on this blue dot up in Victoria, British Columbia, doing some research, but also physiology support for the National Track and Field Program. And my job day to day is to be in the field with coaches and understand their questions, really help with the challenges they're facing day to day, but then bring those questions and challenges back to a multidisciplinary science and medicine team and design projects to try and answer those questions. And in each of these centres, whilst I haven't directly been full-time with triathlon, I have consulted with federations and practitioners in the sport in each of these different centres. So a big part of my anaerobic speed reserve kind of background actually involves a trip that took me 1.5 times around the world. And over 6.5 months, I collected anaerobic speed reserve data on some really elite middle distance runners across 9 or so different countries, 33 different centers, working with a lot of coaches, really understanding that space beyond the VO2 max, specifically in reference to 800, 1500 meter running and the surge events in those races and finishing kick on the last lap of those races. And so some of the insights from working at these different centers are going to bring some ideas to our discussion today. And so here we are. We're in a situation where we see new events emerging, like the Super League. We see increasing participation in mixed team relays. The role of our session today is to really be an ideas meeting that honestly is probably going to generate more questions for you than necessarily answers. But actually that's part of the point, is that you can take these questions, take these ideas away and have those discussions within your performance team, with your other coaches, with your athletes, with your providers, with your management staff. And from those, I think you're going to get some ideas that are going to enable getting more of your athletes to their potential. And that's certainly been my experience with using this concept. I start with this image because there's a great saying from a Canadian sports scientist who well, based in Canada, but British, guy called Stephen Norris, who talks about if you're just evidence-based, then you're following. And when I think of evidence-based, I think of what is published in the scientific literature. And perhaps if we're just evidence-based, and we're just following what's published, then maybe we're on one side of the mountain. But maybe with some solid understanding of scientific first principles and some really contextual understanding of a sport, we can start to step into the unknown a bit more and use that foundation of evidence to really look for and search for some performance advantage. And so today, where we're really going to be operating is actually in this space in the middle. Okay, we're going to be using some of the scientific first principles that we know and understand about the anaerobic speed and power reserve that have been evidenced in running, in cycling. And we're going to step forward from there and go, how could this apply for triathlon? So again, as I say, this is going to be about idea generation. This is going to be about you looking at what questions it raises for you, and then maybe going off in your own environments and going, hey, how do we apply this? So that's really the theme of today. And so if we look at the published research, the evidence base, where are we starting from? Here's where we are. So if you do a journal search for anaerobic speed reserve, it comes back with 23 hits. Now, when I started looking at this topic 6 years ago, it came back with 9 hits. So this is an area that is really emerging and is gathering more and more interest as a potential step forward in an area that's really challenging because we don't have accurate measures of anaerobic energy metabolism. And so to put that in some context, if you search for VO2 max, you get around 11,000 hits. If you search for lactate threshold, about 4,500. Running economy, about 3,000. If you look at cycling mechanical efficiency, about 2,500. And as I said, anaerobic speed reserve, around 23. Now, anaerobic power reserve did come back with 71, but again, a lot of confusion in terminology in this anaerobic space. So I just want to paint that that's our starting point for today. So we're going to use what we've learned in this like limited area of published research to step into some applications in triathlon. And for me, this concept has really delivered in the following areas. In terms of resolution on what does it take to win? A question I've been asking in middle distance running is how fast in terms of absolute sprinting speed is enough to be competitive when we have lots of surging going on? That was a question we didn't know the answer to. And these type of questions really important in triathlon as you know, more and more surging appears in mixed team relays in Super League triathlon. I think there are some real applications for talent ID, and certainly, again, this contract for me has enabled real clarity and targeting of a talent ID approach to actually get more hits. And also in discussion with coaches, with managers, administrators, this concept has really helped align us in understanding different types of athletes, our objectives from a performance standpoint, and how throughout an organization and a pathway we can really optimize what we're doing. And so throughout this session today, it's a real shame we're not in person, but I've created a platform where we're going to have some interaction. So I'd invite each of you now to drop into menti.com, either on your screen or on your phone. And there's a first question that I would like people to participate in. So if you're having any challenges, if you pop that into the chat, and I'm sure Zhao will be able to assist. But feel free to start answering those questions. So periodically throughout the presentation today, we will be dropping into Menti just to see where people are at. This question really is just about understanding what is people's starting point coming into the presentation today. Okay, so we'll allow about 30 more seconds just to get your answers in. So it's certainly seeming like the majority of people on the call have heard of the anaerobic speed or power reserve, but maybe not applied it. And then a fraction who haven't heard of it, and some who have implemented it already. Okay, great. So we can all see where everyone's starting point is with this, and it's different, and that's great. We're going to walk through step by step. Okay, so let's just start with a definition to get us all on the same page. So what we're looking at here is a speed profile of the athlete's maximal aerobic speed, which is depicted by the green bar, and the maximal sprinting speed, which we'll get to how you measure that in a second, which represents the top of this red bar. And the anaerobic speed reserve is this speed range between the two. And you could equally replace speed with power in this kind of graphic, and that would be your maximal aerobic power or your maximal peak power. Obviously, from a scientific point of view, there is an important difference between speed and power, power being a speed cubed, but for representation of this graphic, you can also use it with maximal aerobic power for your cycling component. And one of the interesting things about this is that from these two values, the maximal aerobic speed and the maximal sprinting speed, you can accurately estimate the time duration of performance in that 0 to 5 minute domain. So you could, for example, estimate the type of power you could hold for that duration just from these two bits of data. And we're going to go into some examples of that right now. So here's an example in all-out running in collegiate athletes. So again, if we take this graphic, and these researchers did a ton of all-out efforts from speeds that were very close to the maximal sprinting speed all the way down to efforts that were close to the maximal aerobic speed, which roughly lasts, 6 minute type duration. And what they did was they plotted each of those on a graph, and then they looked to see from these two values of maximal aerobic speed and maximal sprinting speed, could we predict what someone's time to exhaustion would be if we did an all-out effort at 100 seconds or at 200 seconds. And they found a very, very tight relationship. So if you imagine here, a 1.0 is the maximum, a perfect relationship. They got a 0.96 relationship. And that's very interesting when you think about the time durations that some of these new events, say in the Super League, are after. Yes, there's a larger aerobic component to some of these as you're doing these continuously, and there is a fatigue component, but there may be some interesting applications from modeling that effort just using the anaerobic speed reserve. When we step into a cycling example, here we have 12 professional cyclists, and you can see here their max aerobic power values, so a mean of 458 watts with a range, and then a maximal peak power, which was measured over a maximal 10-second effort, and they took the highest 3 seconds as the maximal peak power. But again, when you lined it up between what the athletes actually did and what the model estimated, again, very, very close and tight relationship. So these were the actual power outputs the athletes achieved in training or competition scenarios. And here's the prediction from the anaerobic power reserve model. And so how can we measure these two things? Well, the maximal sprinting speed, I tend to use with middle distance runners. We measure from a 50-meter sprint from a standing start, and that's to give them enough time to account for differences in acceleration mechanics. Most distance runners, in my experience, are hitting their maximal sprint speed somewhere between 35 and 50 meters. On the bike, the studies in professional cycling have used a maximal 6 or 10-second effort and taken that maximal 3-second all-out effort. And then for the max aerobic speed or max aerobic power, typically a 6-minute type effort. So for running, that would be like a 2K time trial type effort. But I realize that for a lot of people, maybe a 1500 is more achievable. And we have done some work where you can convert a 1500 meter time into an estimate of that velocity of VO2 max measured in the lab to give you that lower component of the anaerobic speed reserve. And so to go back to your mentee, if everyone goes back to their page, we're going to check out the next question, which is which of the following most closely represents your position? I already measure maximal sprinting speed and maximal peak power and the maximal aerobic speed and maximal peak power. I only measure maximal aerobic speed or maximal aerobic power. I only measure the maximal sprinting speed or maximal peak power, or I measure neither of those things. Again, no right or wrong answer to this, but it's just looking at where are people's starting point. And one of the reasons that I asked this question is that in my experience talking to providers across sports, a lot of people are actually collecting measures of max aerobic speed, maximal peak power, or maximal sprinting speed and maximal aerobic speed, but they haven't used it together. They've used them in isolation. Whereas a lot of the value, in my opinion, of these two measures is actually using them together to understand the anaerobic power or anaerobic speed reserve, and we can get into that some more. So it seems like a fair number of people are using both of them. Some have dabbled in either of them, and some very new to this concept and aren't currently measuring either of those. So a real mix within the group, which is good. So what does this all mean? Well, if we step into the kind of global demands of triathlon, and we've got here an example of how energy systems fluctuate over time. So along the bottom here, we've got 0 minutes all the way through to 300. And here we've got the percentage of each of the different systems. So we've got kind of the ATP, phosphocreatine, the real fast sprint type energy system, and then the anaerobic glycolytic system here. And then the contribution over time obviously increases of the aerobic system, and there's different fuel feeding into that. But when we overlay the different distances of triathlon, and you say, okay, well, Olympic distance lasts around 2 hours, and you got the sprint that lasts towards an hour, and maybe the mixed team relays or the Super League, where each leg is maybe lasting about 20 minutes. You can see that actually all of them are kind of over to the right and all have a considerable aerobic contribution. And when I look at the time duration relationship of this energy system piece and the event, they're probably all around the 95% plus aerobic demand. And whilst that is useful as a general global characterization of the event, in terms of actionable information, I'm not sure how different that makes your training approach, or what you do if you've got an Olympic distance athlete versus a mixed team relay athlete based on that information. So I think as a general characterization, absolutely is important, and the aerobic system absolutely important to delivering a triathlon performance. But that on its own doesn't really differentiate between what's going on in these races. And with the introduction of Super League and more of this type of language and tactical approach of non-stop bursts, the direction for me of this sport is we need to really start understanding more about this surge piece, more about, well, if someone goes, how do I go with it? And I think this is really where the anaerobic power reserve, anaerobic speed reserve can help us take some steps forward in our understanding. In absence of these accurate measures of anaerobic metabolism, we can really take steps forward in understanding what are the determinants of someone being successful in being able to surge and compete in these events. Because there are moments within these races, and I'm sure you will remember watching some of these, where there is a surge, there is a burst of speed, and the fractions at the end are minuscule. And so there are these moments in races that differentiate medal outcomes. And that just doesn't show up in our general characterization of energy system piece only. It's absolutely important and absolutely the foundation, but it's not the only thing. And that's where this concurrent piece of anaerobic speed or anaerobic power reserve and concurrently looking at what are the energy system pieces, the critical speed, critical power, and maximal aerobic speed, speed of VO2 max piece, alongside that upper maximal sprinting speed and maximal peak power can really perhaps unlock some doors around medal winning determinants. So to see where the group is at around what determines performance, we've got another Menti question for the group. So to move on to the next question, on average, in 2 male triathletes who were positioned number 2 and number 4 on the mixed team relay on the bike leg, how many peaks of power output may they produce above 650 watts? What do people think? So this is about an 11.5-minute section of bike leg. How many times will that athlete be going above 650 watts in 11.5 minutes? Okay, we'll give people another 10 seconds there to get your answers in. So the majority of the group siding with over 11, and yeah, the example, the actual answer is in that 11 to 12 range. So in 11 minutes, we're getting 11 or 12 surges in this case study example, and we're going to get into the fact that there's actually very limited published information on the nuance of this kind of demand. But in this case study, there were 11 or 12 efforts over that threshold of 650 watts. And so if we take that example of 650 watts and go, okay, well, what is the role of the anaerobic power reserve in that? I've got here some example data from professional cycling, and I recommend you check out this work from Dejo Sanders. I chose this data because it was the most complete in terms of giving individual values of both the maximal aerobic speed and the maximal peak power in it. And I couldn't find anything published that gave you such resolution on individual data. So here's an example. These values are going to be a bit higher probably than you expect in triathletes, but let's work with this example. So remember that 650 watts landmark. So here we have 4 different athletes, athlete A, B, C, and D. The green bar represents the athlete's maximal aerobic power. So athlete A's maximal aerobic power is 444 watts, athlete B 500 watts, athlete C 490 watts, athlete D 476 watts. The top of the red bar represents their maximal peak power. So you can see that ranges from anywhere from just over 1,000 watts through to about 1,500 watts. And that's that maximal 3-second peak power from a maximal 6-second sprint. And then we have our line of 650 watts, which we just referred to from the mixed team relay. And you can see that when you start looking at each of these athletes' efforts as a percentage of their anaerobic power reserve, so athlete A, to perform a surge above 650 watts, is having to work at 35% of their anaerobic power reserve, or their red bar. Athlete B, to perform that same kind of effort, is working at 15% of their anaerobic power reserve. Athlete C, 20%. And athlete D, working at 26%. Now, this is obviously a put together example, but you imagine if in an 11.5-minute bike effort, you're having to keep going to 650 watts. And every time I'm athlete A and I'm having to work at 35% of my anaerobic power reserve, but athlete B, I'm only having to work at 15% of my anaerobic power reserve. Who do we think is more likely to be successful in that scenario? These two athletes are playing a totally different game in that scenario. Now, of course, there is an energetic component underpinning this, but we need to understand this kind of relationship a lot more, because we see in these kind of 1 to 5 minute efforts this really playing out, and we're going to get into some of what the science that exists shows in this space. So we're going to start with kind of the first study that I've seen in anaerobic speed reserve, where they took, and this is unfortunately only like recreationally trained students, but they got them to do some time to exhaustion all-out efforts above 2K running pace. And they did this on a treadmill. And what they found was running at 120% of the max aerobic speed, so about kilometer pace, in all-out efforts to exhaustion, that those individuals who were operating at a lower proportion of their anaerobic speed reserve, so only at 18, 20 or 22% of their anaerobic speed reserve, had the longest time to exhaustion. They could go for longer because they were working at a lower proportion of their anaerobic speed reserve. Whereas these athletes over here, who are working at a much higher proportion of their anaerobic speed reserve, could not run for as long. So only about 75 seconds versus 160 seconds. So when we flip back to the example we saw on the last slide, that's like comparing athlete A and athlete B, right? Athlete A working at 35% is down here. Athlete B working at 15% is over here. And so their time to exhaustion at that intensity was very much related to the percentage of anaerobic speed reserve they were working at. So what happens if we move the intensity up, and instead of running at kilometer pace, we move to 600 meter pace? So a more intense surge, 140% of maximal aerobic speed, we find an even stronger relationship. So we found a 0.83 relationship here, and we found an even stronger relationship as we move up in intensity. So those athletes working at 40% of their anaerobic speed reserve here were able to run for the longest at 600 meter pace, compared to those individuals running at 60% or 50%. And so the conclusion from this research was, well, what likely matters most, and we see this in some cycling work, but also running, is that the proportion of the anaerobic speed reserve or power reserve someone is using has a role to play in their ability to surge beyond maximal aerobic speed and VO2 max. So these are all-out time trial efforts. What happens when it's more intermittent, which maybe is a closer representation of what we see in the Super League, for instance? So in this group of team sport athletes, they looked at, if we do 10 by 4 seconds on, 16 seconds off with 2-minute 20 recovery, how many times can we do that? And what relationship does that have with some of these characteristics? So they completed either, well, as many sets as they could. And they separated, well, what determines someone be able to do less than 3 sets versus being able to do 5 or more sets. So here is the data on that. So you can see here we've got some age, height, body mass, training volume to give you an idea. The VO2 max of these two groups. And what they found was, in the initial group, that actually those with a larger velocity of VO2 max had a very, very large chance of doing more than 5 sets of the repeated surging, okay? And those with a larger sprinting speed also had a larger chance. But interestingly, anaerobic speed reserve on its own in this instance did not have a relationship. And that's probably because you can have a large anaerobic speed reserve if you just have a very low speed of VO2 max or maximal aerobic speed. And so that alone is not going to be enough. You know, Usain Bolt has the biggest speed reserve on the planet, but he's not going to be good at repeated surging if he doesn't train aerobically. So there's a minimal level of that aerobic development that you do need as well. And what these authors interestingly did was they actually normalized the anaerobic speed reserve for that velocity of VO2 max. So they essentially gave everyone the same aerobic capacity. And when they did that, they did find that that range then became a factor. So perhaps we're looking at a scenario where, you know, you have a minimum level of maximal aerobic capacity and capability you have to have. And if you don't have that, then having a stronger aerobic capacity is going to be the difference. But once you're operating in a room of athletes who all have a very strong aerobic capability, the anaerobic speed reserve and that range that someone has is now an influencing factor in who can go longer in the repeated surging piece. And this kind of alludes to the fact that at different stages of performance and tiers of performance, there are probably different determinants along that curve. So what does this mean, this study mean? Well, there's a couple of other things they found that when they adjusted, as I said, when they gave everyone the same aerobic capacity, a larger anaerobic speed reserve had a very large relationship with people's ability to perform more than 5 sets of repeated surging. But we do need further investigation into this kind of idea in triathlon. They also found, interestingly, that there was a very large relationship between a lower percentage of the anaerobic speed reserve and a lower percentage of VO2 max and lactate. But again, we need more insight into a triathlon-specific context. A larger anaerobic speed reserve, interestingly, also saw lower neuromuscular impairment and ratings of perceived exertion. So if we can operate at a lower percentage of our ASR, maybe our perception of how hard that is lower. And that to me is interesting from a performance advantage. So we look at these athletes with the varying proportions of the anaerobic power reserve that they're working at, and you go, well, okay, maybe to improve my surge tolerance, the aim is to reduce the proportion of the anaerobic power reserve that a given surge is costing me. And we can do this by 2 ways. We can either try and increase the maximal aerobic power, or we can try and increase the maximal peak power. And the question really becomes, what is the limiting factor to those 2 areas? So very briefly, before we kind of take some questions on this first section, is what are the determinants of those 2 areas? So when I think about maximal sprinting speed and the running section of the triathlon, there's technical components. So what is your biomechanics like? How are you applying force on the ground? You can look at different dominances of stride length or frequency. Are we restricted by our range of motion? Do we have balance deficits? Do we have coordination deficits in the running gait that's limiting our ability to optimize that force expression? So there's some multidisciplinary answers to unpacking some of those. And then on the strength side, how much force can we produce in increasingly short ground contact times as speed increases? And rate of force development is a key piece to that. And then again, of course, making sure that we're not totally losing all the energy every time we hit the ground. And that's balanced with some compliance. So in summary of this kind of first section, there seems to be substantial surge demands within the mixed team relay, Olympic, and anecdotally in the Super League, but we do need more evidence to really provide some resolution on that. When exercising at speeds above the maximal aerobic speed or maximal aerobic power, what likely matters most, irrespective of the athlete profile, or whether it's the bike or the run, is the proportion of the anaerobic speed or power reserve they're working at. And there does seem to be some perceptual benefits for repeated surging from working at a lower percentage of that anaerobic speed reserve. But the evidence in triathlon specifically, this is where we need to get started. And perhaps some conversations after this presentation are the start of making some of that happen. So we're going to take a pause there. And in that first section, I've only really talked about velocity and power. But if you remember from our first Menti, some people hadn't used this concept before. So really important that we bring everyone along together on that path. So here's an example of how tactics in the mixed team relay might influence surge behavior, what's going on in the races. So here we've got a comparison between an athlete who was in the first position on the relay and an athlete who was in the third position on the relay. And you can see here are their number of efforts above 400 watts across 11.5 minutes. So again, if we estimate a maximal aerobic power in an elite female triathlete, it'll be in the early 300s type of range. This is in the anaerobic power reserve domain. Some context around that: athlete 1 was chased initially and then sat in the lead pack and alternated between leading and drafting. And then athlete 3 had a more even time trial pacing approach. So you put it and go, okay, those are two kind of polar strategies to executing the bike leg of a mixed team relay leg. There is a substantial surge demand into that anaerobic power reserve, regardless of strategy. So the questions this raises for me are, we need to really have a wider understanding of these race demands. You know, the demands I've been able to present are from the Triathlon Medicine book, which was released just last year. But these are only case study examples. And so as a community, we need to better look into, well, what are the true demands and get some resolution on that, which becomes very challenging with different courses, and what complements the profiles that you have, which kind of leads us nicely into this kind of talent ID strategy kind of question, because there is such complexity. So to start with, we're going to head back to Menti. So if everyone gets ready to answer those, we've got a sequence of questions here. So the first one, in the Hamburg 2019 event, how many of the top 10 women in the sprint event competed the next day in the mixed team relay? Okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty close tie here between either 6 or 8 of the top 10 or 9 or 10 of the top 10. The answer from this Hamburg event was actually 60% of the women, so 6 out of 10 of the top 10 women competed in the mixed team relay the next day. So a lot of people doing both events. And on the men's side, it was actually 7 out of 10, 70%. And if we move to the next question, the next poll. So in Tokyo 2019 at the Olympic test event, in the Olympic distance event this time, how many of the top 10 women competed the next day in the mixed team relay? Okay, so big split here, still 9 or 10 pretty high numbers, and most people think in the 3 to 5 range. So the answer actually is 50% of the top 10, so 5 out of the 10 women competed in the Olympic distance and the relay the next day, and it was the same number on the men's side, so half of the top 10 in the Olympic competed in the relay the next day. Now, I totally understand that at the moment there is a limit on 6 athletes per nation for the Olympic selection. But I think this poses some really interesting questions for the sport about, you know, is this optimal for performance? That in both the sprint and Olympic events, we have half or over half of the same athletes doing the mixed team relay, where in the Olympic event, we're talking about a 2-hour event versus a 20-minute leg on the mixed team relay. These are very, very different demands. And perhaps in the future, if there were opportunities to create more mixed team relay specialists, perhaps the demands really diverge even more. So this is a big question I see for the future of the sport, because that to me is an extremely high percentage. You know, in track and field, we might have someone do the 5 and 10K, but there's at least 2 or 3 days between the rounds and heats of those events. For someone to back up after an Olympic distance event the very next day in the team relay is definitely suboptimal, in my opinion, in terms of performance. And so it really brings in this question of talent ID and how are we identifying, like, who do we want in this event, in the Olympic event versus the mixed team relay event, and how do we identify those individuals? And so a question for the room, and you can submit up to 3 answers here of what tests do you actually use to identify running potential? You know, when you maybe need someone who can run a good 1500, but someone who can also, you know, run a good 10K. So you can enter into this poll the type of tests you use. And worth saying that all of this is anonymous, so we don't know who said what. So we got some running economy in there, some, yeah, critical power, critical speed, a 3K effort. Some people using maximal sprinting speed, natural technique, okay, 3 and 12 minutes for the critical power, a 1500 meters. So the words that appear biggest are the ones that come in most frequently. So at the moment, running economy and critical speed are the 2 that are most prominently used, which is very interesting. Given, again, as we talked about, critical speed in a well-trained endurance athlete can be sustained for 40 minutes, and running economy typically measured at sub-maximal paces, so below the inflection point on a lactate curve, typically 16, 18 kilometers an hour, which is way below the kind of paces that people are running for a 1500 meters, which are very much in that anaerobic speed reserve domain. It's a very interesting input. Thank you everyone for contributing those insights. So this is actually a perfect follow-up from this poll, because I want to show now how this anaerobic speed and power reserve has really changed the game for me in thinking about, you know, what are we looking for when we think about, you know, that 2-hour event at the Olympic distance versus 20-minute for the mixed team relay for the Super League. And here's a traditional profile that many of you will be very familiar with, that we would use with 800-meter runners. And this is an example of 800-meter athletes, but I see the same trends in 1500, in 5K athletes as well. 5K being 15 minutes for women, 13 minutes for guys. So starting to get into that similar duration of the mixed team relay. And here are 3 athlete profiles. So we've got the velocity of 4 millimole, and we've got the velocity of VO2 max. And I show you these 3 profiles and you say, okay, we've talent ID'd, we've run the critical speed test, or, you know, it's not quite the same, but getting at a similar thing with the velocity of 4 millimole. We've got the running economy, we've got the velocity of VO2 max. Here are 3 athletes. Which events do we put these 3 athletes in? Right, it's very difficult, very difficult to tell from just the aerobic profiling. Very difficult to tell. Running economy may give you some insight, particularly for the longer end of that kind of 2-hour duration, Olympic distance. But when you start getting down into the mixed team relay, the Super League, the super sprint stuff, I'm not sure. And to me, the aerobic profiling in these events that have a lot of surge demands is like from a talent ID perspective, it's kind of like looking at black and white TV. Like you can kind of see something, but it's not that clear, the difference between individuals. Whereas when you add on the maximal sprinting speed or the anaerobic speed reserve, you can start to see some pretty distinct differences between individuals. You can see here, these are athletes for 800 meters performing very similar times and pretty good 1500 times too, but very distinct differences between these types of athletes, even though they present quite similarly aerobically. When you add on that neuromuscular mechanical component, these differences start to emerge and provides maybe color resolution. You know, this is still very first layer. It's maybe not HD, but it's certainly a step forward in understanding some of the differences between the types of athletes. And when I move up to these are some male data now, you can see the types of 1500, 800 PBs. Again, that kind of diversity still appears. And I guess the question is, like, does this show up in triathletes? So I managed to find one paper that had some data of these athlete profiles and Olympic distance athletes from the French national team back in 2009. And so what we have here are profiles of the anaerobic power reserve on the bike. So we have the female data on the left-hand side, we have the male data on the right, and you can see it's a small sample, but this was all the data I could find. You can see the variability in the maximal aerobic power is not very big at all, meaning that actually the aerobic component fairly similar between individuals, whereas the variation in that maximal peak power, that all-out 3-second effort, is very, very different between individuals. You can see the minimum and maximums within those athletes there. And so this raises all kinds of interesting questions from a talent ID perspective of, hey, maybe there are some people within this cohort that are more suited to one to the other. And are we, able to steer more in one direction or the other? And what kind of benchmarks might be needed for the Super League versus the Olympic distance? And so it raises all kinds of questions and ideas in this space of how fast is enough, how important is it to have it in the Olympic distance, not as much as in the mixed team relay and the super sprint, but as Zhao mentioned in the Q&A section, there are still a substantial amount of surges on the bike and in the run in the Olympic events. And so this anaerobic power reserve, anaerobic speed reserve, for me, can really be a framework for helping categorize and understanding the differences that you see within your athlete profiles and within your testing. And an important thing to really land is that actually, if you don't collect the maximal peak power or the maximal sprinting speed, and you just take the aerobic measures, these differences do not emerge in your data. You do not see them. You are in this scenario, right? If you don't test anything beyond that velocity of VO2 max, you don't see that insight. You don't see the resolution, the differences that appear. And so how I think about using that in terms of understanding that variability is you can take that maximal sprinting speed or the velocity of VO2 max, and you can divide one by the other and plot those differences. And you can see that the more speed-based athletes are on the far left-hand side of things, and more endurance-based on the far right of things. And this might be in a triathlon context that you've got, maybe more mixed team relay type candidates on the left-hand side, and maybe more Olympic distance type candidates on the right-hand side. But again, this needs exploring. We've seen within a very small sample of a triathlon population of Olympic distance athletes that there is this variation, but we need to understand it over a wider population. And why does this matter is kind of a multi-layered answer question. But the first piece is really leading on to the event demands. And this recent paper, which I encourage you to check out, is looking at what are the determinants of races if they're slow or if they're fast? So if they have gun to tape, nice and even from the beginning, more time trial type effort, or if they're slow and then they have surging in them. And ultimately they were different, the determinants were different in different types of races. And we need further information on this kind of insight in triathlon, which is really tricky when you consider course profiling, like even trying to understand the demands in preparing this presentation. You've got camera angles that cut out, and it's very, very challenging to actually quantify what's going on. So this is a sub-elite group of 1,500 athletes, but I'm going to show you how the determinants came out differently in slow versus fast races. Now this is a 4 minute type duration. So it would be similar to the run on a mixed team relay or some of the Super League type triathlon. So I'm going to show you a couple of columns here. On one column, we're going to have the performance determinants, so the physiological measure. And on the next column, we're going to have the percentage that variable explained the outcome of performance. So a maximum of 100 is possible in that column. So here we have type 2 muscle fibers, anaerobic capacity, but that was measured with a very noisy test. The anaerobic speed reserve, maximal sprinting speed, critical speed, some of you mentioned, the running economy, velocity at VO2 peak, and the relative VO2 peak. And this is so a slow race, slow overall time, which led to more surging within the race. And you can see, first of all, the contribution that some of the more anaerobic speed power type measures had to performance, but you can also see how there was zero explained variance in that 1,500 meters in the women's cohort from running economy. And when we go back to our poll, we can see how running economy was one of the most measured tests to identify running potential. So this asks some really interesting questions about what is the value of running economy in identifying 1,500 type performance. We can debate that in the questions. Then they compared that to the determinants in a fast race. So this is a more even pace type time trial type effort. And you can see it's in this type of race where some of those more classic measures that many of you are testing held a stronger proportion of the variance. Now you will notice that I've highlighted in red the anaerobic speed reserve and the maximal sprinting speed. And the reason I've highlighted those two is because all of the other relationships were positive. So for example, in this scenario, a better running economy had a positive relationship with performance. But in this scenario, a larger anaerobic speed reserve had a negative relationship with performance. And that is because those individuals had a large anaerobic speed reserve because they were unfit aerobically. So again, back to the question that was asked in the kind of halftime interval, there seems to be this piece of actually in sub-elite populations, maybe this anaerobic speed reserve doesn't differentiate. But when we then look at, the more elite populations, and we look at this national team, ITU, World Circuit population, you can see in the aerobic markers, the max aerobic power here, there's no real difference between those individuals. The differences are showing up perhaps up here. And so again, this is an idea, this is a narrative to explore, but potentially what gets you to the elite level is maybe this aerobic piece. And then once you're there, it's having this extra piece as well to be able to compete with surges. If Vincent Louis takes off on the bike, can you go with it? Can you go with it once? Can you go with it 11 times in a mixed team relay leg? That is a different question to what are the requirements of me qualifying to be in the race? And so that's where I really feel like at the different layers of performance, there's a different balance of these determinants. And ultimately, we need to know a ton more about this in the sport, given the complexity of the sport, but a real opportunity for people to explore. And I think, this really helps with stakeholder alignment, because we've shown here there's variation in the type of profiles, there's complexity to the events. So where are we heading, right? Where are we heading? What type of athletes do we have? What type of event do we want to specialize in? What's the complexity of the course profile, and what does our race strategy look like, maybe considering all of these things? And then what type of athletes do we need in the program to be able to deliver on these things? And you can see how this conversation of just having, well, who do we have? What do we have? What type of races, type of courses, type of strategy does that lend itself to? Opens up a whole more targeted approach with this kind of alignment. So these are big, big questions that we're not going to solve in this presentation, but it starts with asking the questions. So perhaps, and again, we need to see the studies showing this, but maybe maximizing the anaerobic speed and power reserve can actually improve our athletes' tactical flexibility. Because if we have a really high velocity of VO2 max and a critical speed and a maximal sprinting speed and power, whether it's slow, we're going to be comfortable. Whether it's fast, we're going to be comfortable. But perhaps if we only have a small anaerobic speed reserve and anaerobic power reserve, and every time there's a surge, we're working at a really high percentage of what we have, then maybe it's not going to play out that well for us when we're competing against people who do have that reserve. And you can flip that the other way of, actually, if we're not fit enough aerobically and we can't hold those paces, we're not going to be there if it's a more time trial type style race. So this isn't an either or, you have to come to the table with both. And my opinion is that the people on the podium, and I certainly have seen this in my work in track and field, the people on the podium have both. And yes, there's a tactical component to that, there's a psychological component to that, there's a positioning, there's an environment, there's all these layers, which is why actually having all the stakeholders on the same page about this complexity can really help create performance advantage for you. Because I'm anticipating that as we move forward in the future of this, non-stop burst surge type event demands, that actually the best are going to have both of those capabilities. And actually to compete with them, you're also going to have to do that. And that poses some really big, challenging strategy questions for the sport. And yeah, it's going to be a great Q&A section afterwards. So I've hopefully shared with you in this presentation the construct that for me has really, really delivered more insight onto winning determinants, and in triathlon, perhaps some more avenues to explore in understanding what are the winning determinants. Maybe a strategy to revisit, how do we talent ID people? How do we think about that process? And again, can bring that conversation of these different types of profiles, different types of events, how do we bring that together? And before we get into the final take homes, we've just got one last poll here for the group. So if you can rate out of 5 your answer to the following questions. Okay, so final answers, get your final answers in. And as we said right at the beginning of the session, today was about creating ideas, giving you a bit of the landscape and the opportunity in this area. And it looks like from the feedback, hopefully it's given you some new ideas, giving you some answers to, well, some ideas to create some conversations within your environment and maybe explore this concept a bit further. So thank you everyone for your feedback and engaging in the polls throughout the session. So just to kind of recap on the final take homes. So the first one is, moving forward, maybe considering how can we minimize that percentage of the anaerobic speed or power reserve that we are operating within in these events. How can we do that? And we can maybe get into that a bit more in the questions. There are horses for courses. There is so much complexity in your sport that I believe the ASR, APR kind of framework can be a tool to help bring some of that complexity into a conversation. It can create a distribution of profiles for you to have conversations with both coaches, athletes, but also performance staff, also administrators and funding partners to let's understand this and understand this in relation to the course profiles and the demands and goals of the program. And together that can hopefully bring some more alignment to really optimizing your athletes' potential in these events. So thank you very much. And I got some thank yous to people who've been thought partners in helping me prepare this presentation. And you can find any of my research on the ResearchGate or get in touch via Twitter. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation, and I'd be happy to take some questions.